I've been on a bit of a 2001 kick lately. I've faithfully called it my favorite movie for the better part of a decade, watched the film a dozen times, and read the novel nearly as many, and just recently finished Michael Benson's fantastic book on the making of the two. But for all that time, I've never been able to interface with 2001: A Space Odyssey academically. The closest I've come is an essay on the power of fan edits using Soderbergh's edit of the film as my primary source, but I have yet to do anything critical with the film itself. Maybe I never will, but it always leaves me thinking. This time around, it left me thinking about science fiction and technology. The film's antagonist of sorts, HAL 9000, is a technological terror for the ages, being almost completely in control of the spaceship Discovery, and with enough agency to assassinate one crew member, cut life support for 3 more, and reach a stalemate with the last survivor. But what's more, he's almost nothing like the technology we surround ourselves with today. It seems like one of the terrifying futures envisioned during the 20th century has been sidestepped, at least for the moment. Watching the movie half a century on feels anachronistic, because it is. HAL is part of a retro future, a sort of science fiction that predicts, somewhat inaccurately, the course of evolution that technology will follow. The term is more commonly used to refer to a visual style, like Fallout's Atomic Age-inspired art or the Jetsons' vision of tomorrow, but it feels just as applicable to the foretelling that sci-fi stories attempt. Nowadays, HAL feels otherworldly, plausible but impossible, and that might make him even more terrifying. The role HAL plays in the film, as the empowered digital mind succumbing to anxiety and neuroses, feels familiar. That's probably because the trope, still popular today, was only just getting started in 1968. Specifically, it's a trend most prevalent in the science fiction films of the 80s. Maybe it's because 2001 received a sequel in 1984, or the fact that 2077 is still fresh in the internet's collective consciousness, but I'm drawn to the rain-slicked, neon-drenched, synthy vibe of the 80s' most distinctive genre, cyberpunk. But that leaves the question. Is 2001: A Space Odyssey secretly the first cyberpunk film? Throughout the 60s and 70s, science fiction went through a sort of metamorphosis. Gone were the vaguely utopian stories of stellar explorers and well-behaved androids, as new writers sought to explore isolation, sexuality, psychedelia, and other grittier concepts. Cyberpunk emerged from those gloomier themes, championed by the likes of Philip K. Dick, Harlan Ellison, Roger Zelazny, and other post-pulp sci-fi writers that were too young or too disillusioned to get in on the golden age. Even so, cyberpunk wouldn't be fully realized until a decade or two later. In an onslaught of content in 1982, the genre emerged and lodged itself into the public consciousness. In that year alone, Ridley Scott released Blade Runner, the story of a man tasked with hunting down rogue replicants. Disney released Tron, which took a hacker programmer inside the world of the computer to interact with anthropomorphized applications and fight the Master Control program, and meanwhile, overseas in Japan, Otomo would publish the manga version of Akira, with bike-based action and violence begging for a screen adaptation. William Gibson's Neuromancer in 1984, however, best defined the genre. It adopted plenty of tropes from Blade Runner and the novel that had inspired it, and brought forth a slew of new ones, becoming the definitive cyberpunk artifact. Without getting into too much detail, a hacker named Case has his ability to go into cyberspace restored, so he can help two halves of an AI superconsciousness reunite, for purposes never made totally clear. 1988 proved to be another landmark year for the genre, seeing both the anime release of Akira, one of the most colossal undertakings in the art form's history, and the release of Mike Pondsmith's cyberpunk tabletop role-playing game, now best recognized in tandem with CD Projekt Red's adaptation of Cyberpunk 2077. Despite predecessors and numerous other entries into the genre, these works serve as cyberpunk Rosetta Stones, outlining its distinctive style and defining qualities. So what can we take from this timeline? I think the best conclusion we can draw is that cyberpunk, as a genre, came into its own during the 1980s, but has roots reaching as far back as 1960s. What really matters, though, are the tropes. Cyberpunk, like any other genre, is defined by stereotypical tropes, from setting to themes to characters. By and large, there are 2 key settings for a cyberpunk story. 1, an overdeveloped city, usually ruled by corporations and covered from sewer to skyscraper in advertisements and neon, and topped with a thick layer of smog resulting from hyper-industrialization. The power of the corporations is unrivaled. If a recognizable system of government still exists, it bends completely to the will of companies. 2, cyberspace. Cyberpunk stories are rife with characters obsessed with going into the machine, hacking, stealing, and doing it all from a souped-up gaming chair, complete with goggles and electrodes. The net plays an interesting role in cyberpunk stories, usually restricting a character's physical body while letting their consciousness explore space and time in a whole new way. Cyberspace isn't a light adventure though, because getting caught by an intrusion countermeasure could end your mission, if not your life. Characters in these stories aren't much better off. Pondsmith's RPG best lays out the gamut of struggling survivors. The rulebook for Cyberpunk 2020 details rebellious rocker boys, solo assassins, hackers called netrunners, cyborg techies, and nomadic road warriors, along with reporters, cops, fixers, and corporates. In a cyberpunk world, there's no such thing as a stable character. Even members of the elite corporate class are always at risk from both ends of the food chain. They're as likely to be taken out by a rival or company superior as they are to fall victim to a disillusioned member of the usually drugged masses. Characters in these stories find ways to survive by any means necessary. That brings us to the fun part, the themes. In case it wasn't obvious already, cyberpunk stories don't look too kindly on industrialization and commercialization. Corporations are usually portrayed as cutthroat, not to mention infinitely exploitive and wholly dangerous. It's usually someone from that echelon experimenting with new technology that leads to the story's overarching threat. Even more than that, however, cyberpunk stories are fascinated with the barrier between man and machine. You can augment yourself with cybernetic enhancements that increase your physical or mental abilities, though you're just as likely to be tampered with under the knife and left as a ticking time bomb, unbeknownst to you or your victims. Synthetic beings and intelligences go toe-to-toe with their human counterparts, whether they're Blade Runner's replicants or Neuromancer's digital minds that battle or ally with each other for dominance over the world. Most importantly, it's not clear in these stories what it means to be human. When half of our bodies have been replaced with cybernetic equipment, are we still human, or are we only half human, along with what's left of our organic bodies? Is our innate humanity totally unrelated to our physical form? And what about artificial intelligences that can think and emote exactly like humanity? Ambiguity, as illustrated by the likes of Neuromancer's denouement and Blade Runner's refusal to tell viewers if Deckard is a replicant or a human, is central. How does a Space Odyssey fit into all of this? First, let's look at the facts. If we assume Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, the novel that inspired Blade Runner, to be the first true cyberpunk narrative, then the genre was born in 1968. 2001, though in production for several years beforehand, was released as a film and published as a novel that same year, so we're in the range of plausibility. But how does the content stack up? Is the Stargate just a stylish precursor to Neon Overload? We can hardly argue that 2001 takes place in a corporate-run dystopia on rain-slicked streets, but Kubrick's film has a very intentional commercial tilt, especially during its second act. After our foray into prehistory with the Man-Ape's discovery of tools, Kubrick and Clarke fast-forward to the turn of the century. We follow Dr. Heywood Floyd, chairman of the National Council of Aeronautics, on a flight up to the moon to investigate what turns out to be the second monolith. Before arriving at Clavius Base, however, Floyd has a layover at an orbital space station, a sequence that, unlike the vast majority of the film, is constantly emblazoned with corporate logos. During this sequence, you can spot a slew of brands, including Pan Am, Parker Pens, IBM Computers, Hilton Hotels, Amex, Bell Telephones, Howard Johnson, Whirlpool, Aeroflot, and GM. And this doesn't include products that aren't visibly branded, like the gin chairs aboard the space station, Arn Jacobson cutlery used by the crew of Discovery, or product placements that didn't make it into the final cut, like Macy's and Parker Brothers. Benson reports that, apart from IBM, companies approached included Armstrong Corks, Seabrook Farms, Bausch & Lomb, and Whirlpool. The number of firms consulted ultimately topped 40. While no dystopian hellscape, 2001 was under no illusions that the future would be free of corporate logos. Hal, like the various AIs that would become commonplace in cyberpunk novels, is described as just about human in several instances. He's called the sixth crewmate aboard the Discovery a number of times, and it's clear through conversations and interactions that Frank and Dave, if only through conscious effort, see Hal as another wholly sentient being aboard the Discovery. The book goes into even more detail, saying, "The sixth member of the crew cared for none of these things, for it was not human. It was the highly advanced HAL 9000 computer, the brain and nervous system of the ship. In the 1980s, Minsky and Good had shown how neural networks could be generated automatically, self-replicated, in accordance with any arbitrary learning program. Artificial brains could be grown by a process strikingly analogous to the development of a human brain. In any given case, the precise details would never be known, and even if they were, they would be millions of times too complex for human understanding. Whatever way it worked, the final result was a machine intelligence that could reproduce, though some philosophers still preferred to use the word mimic, most of the activities of the human brain, and with far greater speed and reliability. And lastly, while 2001 lacks a sequence in which a character goes into cyberspace, it does feature Dave Bowman literally entering Hal's brain room. In the film's climax, Bowman forces his way back into the Discovery, dons a space helmet, and collects the tools necessary to lobotomize the rogue computer. In a sequence that's thrilling on the page and utterly pulse-pounding on screen, Bowman methodically, obsessively, and coldly pulls Hal's memory units from their sockets, reducing his consciousness down to its most automatic levels. The notion of murdering a computer, not just deactivating it or shutting it down, gets back to that ambiguous question of humanity, and definitely stands out as an early example of cyberpunk philosophy. So, is 2001 the first cyberpunk movie? Not really, but it offers some insight into the tropes that would define the later genre. 2001 is, as Clarke and Kubrick called it, the proverbial really good science fiction movie, and trying to define it as something more specific than that can get a bit hairy. Hal might not be a consciousness enslaved by the corporate elite, and Bowman is a far cry from Case or Flynn, but without the former, we may never have had the latter. I think it's safe to say that even though Kubrick and Clarke didn't make the first cyberpunk film, they paved the way for Ridley Scott and William Gibson, and that's something incredible. He's called the sixth crewmate aboard the Discovery a number of times, and it's clear through conversations and interactions that Frank and Dave, if only through conscious effort... Gotta cut that.